Well, New York City churches will still be allowed to rent school buildings for their church services. Hi, I'm Shawn Akers, Vice President for Middle Eastern Affairs with Liberty Counsel, and joining me again in studio today is Ron Miller, author, blogger, and commentator on all things religious and political. Ron, thanks for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Ron, this is another interesting case to follow the one that we did yesterday. We talked yesterday about the South Carolina case in which the court has ruled that students can get up to 2 credit hours by going to religious training outside of the school system, and the courts kindly said that the mere choice by a student to allow God into his life is not something that's going to be treated with anathema in that state. And now we see something following on that with a case in New York City. Now, Ron, this one is another good one. There has been a lot of controversy through the years over whether churches should be allowed, like anybody else in society, to take advantage of schools offering their premises for rent. As you know, virtually any institution except a church has been allowed to do that at will. They can rent the school when the school's open. It creates extra funding for the school and relieves some of the tax need there, and it provides a space for people to hold their activities. Well, churches, ironically, have been singled out and said that you can't do that. But a court in New York City has disagreed, Ron.
It's interesting that this would even come up because growing up in different places and going to different churches, I've been to churches that started in school buildings or school board facilities. And it was very common and no one ever questioned it for the very reason you cited. If any organization has the means to pay the rent, they should be able to use the facility without any particular discrimination. So this is just another vestige of society trying to push religion out of public life altogether. And the fact that the courts ruled in its favor is just another indication that they understand that people of faith did not abdicate their First Amendment rights by joining a church.
Well, Ron, there are really 2 points here that we have to look at closely. One is this again shows this theme. You're not talking about the church, the school doing anything except renting a building. There's no activity by the school. There's no participation in the religious programs by school officials. It's most assuredly not an official school function any more than anybody else renting the building would be. But you still face this same thing that we talked about yesterday, where the Freedom from Religion Foundation and the ACLU and several others that are fear-mongers on this issue that find an establishment of religion behind every stone treat God and treat religion as if anything that comes in contact with it has somehow been made radioactive and can't be allowed to be involved with the state. Now, I'll tell you what's ironic about this is you've heard the phrase, no good deed goes unpunished. And it's kind of like inviting someone into your house and then them kicking you out. Because if we remember, original colonies in the United States, communities in early America, 1776 and forward. The communities in America existed very much like this. The center of the community existed a church, and around the church existed businesses and homes. And that church invited the school in. And now the school has attempted, some 200 years later, to kick the church out and say you're not even welcome on our premises, that we're going to eradicate every vestige of the religion that brought the very blessings that we enjoy. Now, Ron, this takes it to an absolute extreme to say that we are going to discriminate as a state and say that anybody who would like to can rent our premises except for a church is simply religious discrimination.
There's no other way to describe it. And when I tell people that we didn't give up our First Amendment rights by joining a church, I point to the fact that the very first freedom in the First Amendment, the very first one, before freedom of speech, is the freedom of religion. And the founders were absolutely convinced that that was going to be the cornerstone of this self-governance that they planned to build into the Constitution. And you're right, the church was the center of the community. In fact, the church has started many schools. And so there is an irony in that now the church, which was a wellspring of our education system here in America, is now seeing that very education system trying to turn on it and just squeeze it out altogether.
It's ironic, Ron, that you say that we don't give up our First Amendment rights by joining a church. I really, really like that because it definitely shows the irony of this. The very first official document of the United States of America, the first letter that we ever drafted, the Declaration of Independence, said, not implied, it said just the opposite, that we are endowed by our Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. It said that all of our rights, and by the way, it went on to say that governments are instituted among men for the purpose of protecting these rights. That's the reason government exists, is to protect the rights that God gave individuals. Now, it's very ironic, isn't it, to see that exactly what you're saying is taking place, that legal arguments are being made around the nation that if you acknowledge God, you are giving up your First Amendment rights. You don't have the right to speak in schools, though you can write on just about anything else. Students are given a hard time when they try to write about God because that's somehow an establishment of religion. That anybody that would like to rent the facility can, except for a church. Now, luckily, Ron, the one thing that has not been completely eradicated in the United States is common sense, because the court system, even in New York City, ground zero for the culture war, has said that no, this is a little ridiculous, that churches have the same rights as everyone else to rent the building.
We talk about the freedom of religion and the establishment clauses where these groups always run to. And their distortion of history is just egregious because the establishment clause was clearly meant to protect all faiths or no faith from imposition from on high. This was not meant to forbid the expression of faith from the bottom up. It was meant to keep government from imposing its beliefs. We know what happens when government does that. We saw it in the European nations before America was formed. We saw it in Germany when basically the Nazi Party co-opted the German church. That's the kind of establishment that we're trying to prevent. We aren't trying to prevent everyday citizens from speaking out on their faith, coming together in assembly for their faith, and even petitioning their government based on their values. Those are all protected.
You can ask yourself very simply, look, just ask yourself what the government is attempting to do and the tactics it's employing to do it. We tend to hear that spun as a religious issue, but it's really not. Ask yourself simply this: is the government stopping speech by citizens or allowing speech by citizens? It's as simple as that. Whether you take exactly as you said with the Nazi regime co-opting the church in Germany, what you had was the Nazis saying, you can't say so-and-so. You have to say such and such. And in the United States, ask yourself, which would yield greater freedom for the American people? Each person being allowed to say what's on their heart, to stand up and, talk. If you don't believe in any God at all, you're free to say that. You're actually free to say that now. But you can't stand up and say that Jesus Christ is my Lord and Savior without being given a terribly hard time about it. But ask yourself, which one yields freedom? Allowing citizens to speak in their own rights on their own behalf or not? And what you find is that these movements, without exception, come down the side of taking away speech.
And in fact, it doesn't take a formal government edict to be suppression of free speech. As we've seen in all of the authoritarian societies in our history, they all tend to start with this cultural suppression, which is what this is essentially. There's a cultural suppression out there, and they're trying to use the court system to back them up. And eventually that's going to lead to suppression at the governmental level. It always has, and we need to be vigilant and stand against it.
Well, the ADF has done a good job. The Alliance Defense Fund actually handled this case in New York City. They did a fantastic job of seeing this one through. And this case makes a point that we citizens of the United States still have the ability to have an impact. You can join with Liberty Counsel in attempting to shape this culture. Call us at 1-800-671-1776 and ask how you can become involved with Liberty Counsel.